All right, welcome back to risk management. So, to start things a little bit differently today, I have something that's actually, in a way, kind of a review of tort law, but also then touches on contract law, which we'll get to in a couple modules. But what I've got for you here, you can see that you may find the video disturbing, and what the video is, it comes from something called a bull bash, which is effectively just a partial rodeo. So it's a bull riding contest, but it doesn't include like a full rodeo would, where you've got steer wrestling and team roping and all those other kinds of things. This is just a bull riding contest. And in between the bull riding events, there are games to entertain the crowd. And so one of the games that was played this particular night was something called Cowboy Pinball. So this bull riding event is in a town called Owensboro, Kentucky, which is about 2 hours southwest of Louisville. And so what happens in this game in Cowboy Pinball is that the promoters of the event have taken chalk and made circles inside of the bull riding arena. And then they taped a $100 bill to the side of a bucking bull. They asked, before the event started, for volunteers who wanted to participate in this game, in this Cowboy Pinball game. People signed a waiver, and then when it was time, they came down into the arena and they took their place in these little chalk circles. And so the gist of it is they're going to turn this bull loose inside of the arena with the flank strap on, which is the thing that makes it buck. And if you can stay inside of your chalk circle and manage to pull that $100 bill off of the bull, that is yours to keep. But if you leave the chalk circle, then you lose. And again, this is an angry bull that's going to be rushing at you, so it's going to be pretty tough to stay in your chalk circle and be able to snag that $100 bill. So I'm going to show you the video, and then I'm going to tell you or read you some quotes from some of the promoters about the waiver for the event. All right, so here we go. And watch this guy and this guy. Pull my pointer up. Watch this guy and this guy. All right, so I'm going to run that back one more time because one of the things I want to call your attention to is the removal of this guy up here from the arena after he gets knocked over. So, all right, they're getting ready to let the bull go. So again, watch this guy, and then watch this guy. This lady's smart enough to take off running. All right. So again, watch how they remove him from the arena. So I think the removal is relevant. You know, obviously you don't have time to get out there and fully spine board somebody if there's an angry bull running around. But at the same time, if that guy had a neck injury, certainly it could be made worse by being dragged off like that. So an additional risk on top of the actual initial insult of being struck by the bull. Okay, so after the event, one of the event's promoters, who's a guy named Matt Allgood, about the event said, quote, "They all agreed, they signed a waiver, and the waiver says injuries and death. It was like a make some money the hard way kind of a game." He went on to say, "They had every option to get out of the arena and to get out of there, but they wanted that money. If I saw that happening, if I'd have been them, I'd be running to the gate." And so that individual, that promoter, Allgood, also pointed out that the company gave everybody who participated the option of wearing one of the protective vests that the bull riders wear, but that none of them elected to use them. The announcer for that event, his name is Marvin Blanton, said, quote, "The waiver is a typical waiver that's out there. The guys are talked to up front. We've done this event quite a bit throughout the South, and they've loved the entertainment about it, or entertainment of it. The show wasn't about the last 3 minutes of it. It's unfortunate that one guy got hauled out on a stretcher. The important thing is the right people were there. They had paramedics that were taking care of him. End quote. So one of the things to think about with tort law is that tort law and contract law are oftentimes in conflict with each other. So the basic principle of tort law is that if somebody is negligent, that and their negligence impacts you, if it causes you damage, that you can sue them to be made whole. So that if somebody else hurts you in some way, economically, etc., that you can try to recover that damage, right? But contract law, on the other hand, says that consenting adults can choose to put themselves in dangerous or unsafe situations. It says a number of other things, but that's kind of one of the relevant principles of contract law here. And that if you do that, you as a consenting adult understand and appreciate the risks. And so because of that, even if there is harm to you, because you understood and appreciate the risks and chose to participate anyway, that whoever puts you in that situation doesn't bear any liability. Now, one of the things to consider is that when we think about waivers, that waivers only protect you against ordinary negligence. So think back to when we talked about ordinary negligence. One of the concepts there, so ordinary negligence typically is they didn't intend to commit the act, they didn't intend to cause harm, right? So they forgot to do some sort of safety protocol. There's an oversight oftentimes. That's as opposed to reckless misconduct or gross negligence. And you can see the definition of reckless misconduct there. So it's the intentional performance of an act while disregarding a known risk that is so great as to make harm highly probable. So if the guy here in the khaki pants that really got flipped and then got dragged out of the arena, so if that guy turns around and sues the bull riding company, it's going to generate a really interesting question of, did this rise to the level of reckless misconduct, or was this something that was covered by the waiver? So the question, the primary question here then is, were the participants able to understand and appreciate the risks? So obviously a consenting adult who signs that sort of a waiver understands that by climbing into a fenced-off arena with an angry 2,000-pound bull, that there are some pretty significant injuries that could result. And so does the waiver that they signed absolve the bull riding company of any sort of injuries that might have happened? Or was it possible that the risk was beyond that the signees, that all the participants, was the risk beyond what they would have contemplated? And should the company have known that there was such that harm was so highly probable that that event probably shouldn't have taken place? So effectively then, did they disregard a known risk and that made harm highly probable? So the class is usually kind of 50-50 split on this one. Oftentimes people feel like, they side with the bull riding company, that everybody in there signed a waiver. If you're an adult, you know that getting inside a ring with a bull is going to be pretty risky, and if you get hurt, then that's your own fault. And then sometimes people feel that, in fact, this did rise to the level of reckless misconduct on the part of the bull riding company, that company disregarded a known risk, that it was more likely than probably the participants would have contemplated that they could be seriously injured, and despite that knowledge, the bull riding company ignored that, which then made harm highly probable. So it presents an interesting case, like I said, from the standpoint that there's going to be that conflict between tort law and contract law, and who wins out in this case. All right, so that video aside, let's talk about risk management. The thrilling world of risk management, I should say. All right, so one of the things to understand about risk management is that, so obviously the terminology management, it's not risk elimination. So if we eliminate risk, we get rid of it completely. Risk management is, we know that there will be some harm that could result by offering certain programs. So by offering football, lacrosse, hockey, wrestling, any number of other contact sports, there's some harm that could result by a school sponsoring those sports, or by a recreational organization sponsoring those sports, for example. But they're willing to accept that risk, and they're going to try to minimize the harms that'll occur while still offering those activities. So the idea behind risk management then is to make things as safe as possible while realizing that there's still going to be some risks involved with sponsoring that activity. So whether that's something like whitewater rafting, rock climbing, or different sports, people participate in certain types of events looking for risk. So one of the really good things to point to is like adventure races. So where you're climbing underneath barbed wire, or you're jumping over fire, or you're muddy and wet and slippery and you're trying to climb really high obstacles, those kinds of things. Part of the reason that people participate in those events is actually because of the risk. So if we made that event perfectly safe, well, then nobody would want to participate. So again, the idea there is to make them as safe as possible while still allowing for some risk. So risk management, then, we're reducing the likelihood of loss. We're reducing the likelihood that we'll be sued successfully and that it'll cost us money, or that it'll cost our insurance company money. So in terms of the type of risk that sport managers should think about, so one of the types is personnel issues. So if you're a manager, obviously you're going to be in charge of people. You're going to have employees that work under you. And so some of those employees may be engaged in things like discrimination, harassment. They may be poorly trained. They may be doing a terrible job, not training their athletes correctly, those kinds of things. And so because your employees are, let's say, harassing people or failing to properly instruct or supervise their students or their athletes, that's something that you as their manager could be liable for, because you should have known, or you knew, in fact, that they were doing those things and you didn't take any action to correct it. So that's one source of risk, is what is it that your employees are up to. Other ones, so the possibility of player or fan violence. So you can see in the picture there, fan violence there, where people are throwing flares onto the field. There have been incidents in the U.S. In recent years where you've got fan violence that takes place in the parking lot. So there was a case from several years ago, I think it was give or take 2014, 2015, in the parking lot of Dodger Stadium in LA. For opening day that year, the San Francisco Giants, who are one of the LA Dodgers' big rivals, were in town for opening day. And so there was a Giants fan who'd come down for the game, and he was wearing all of his Giants gear, and he was a paramedic by training. Ends up getting into a fight with some Dodgers fans, gets punched, falls down, hits his head, I think on a curb, somehow hits his head on the ground, and it ends up suffering permanent brain damage. And so one of the things the Dodgers had to do after that was to reevaluate the security around their stadium. There was a lawsuit over that, and I can't remember whether or not the Giants fan was successful. I think he was. But anyway, you can look it up pretty easily. So there's that. I mean, there have been incidents in NFL stands, NFL parking lots, those kinds of things. So one thing to think about is, and especially in a place like Wisconsin where tailgating is so big, how it is that you're going to ensure adequate safety for the patrons before and after the games that you need to ensure safety for. If they're in their own front yard a few blocks away, well, that's a different issue. You're not probably liable for that. But if they're in the parking lot for your stadium and there's some violence that breaks out, there's possibly some liability on your part. Other things, so related to weather, so things like heat stress, tornadoes, lightning, those kinds of things that can cause problems for both your athletes, your officials, and then also your fans. So to consider how it is that we're going to, so for example, one of the things when I was in college 20 years ago now, the University of Texas used to have 11 a.m. or 2 o'clock kickoffs on for some of their early season games. And so if you kick off at 2 o'clock in September, it's still over 100 degrees. And so you're going to be out there in over 100 degree weather for 4 solid hours in the stands just kind of hanging out. And so for some of the older fans, you'd have fans who would have heat illness, heat exhaustion. And so early on, they didn't necessarily have the best plan to deal with those kinds of things. So then later they started offering free water, having cooling stations, those kinds of things, right? Other things, so fan celebrations. One of the things now that schools are getting a lot of pushback on is fans rushing onto the court. So how do you ensure the safety of all the athletes, both yours and the visiting teams, as well as the coaching staffs and the officials for each of those teams, and the game officials, if you've got 1,000 fans rushing onto the court. So then how do you prevent that? There's some push and pull there, because it's one of those things like that gets shown on SportsCenter over and over and over again, and it's kind of a cool moment, but at the same time, there is the possibility that somebody could get hurt, one, in the rush from the stands, but two, athletes or officials or whoever could get hurt by some of the fans, and obviously that would be problematic. Terrorism. So, one of the things that a lot of schools have done now to address that is move to things like clear bag policies. So to make sure that people aren't bringing things into the stadium that they're not supposed to be. And then having a plan for if something happens, how do you deal with that? And so we'll talk about that later in the slideshow. Other things, so health emergencies. You have fans that have health emergencies in the stands. You have people that have heart attacks, people that have strokes, etc. How are you going to get them evacuated from the stadium? But also at times you have players suffer on the field health emergencies, and that may be a traumatic injury, that may be a head injury, or that may be cardiovascular or related to their cardiovascular system. So being able to plan for those, and for the most part, the on-field emergencies are handled by the sports medicine staff. But if you're an athletic director, you still have oversight over that sports medicine staff. So something to think about there. As far as child protection goes, from a college standpoint, or to some extent professional sports, that pertains largely to your camps. And so how do you, if you have summer baseball camps or softball camps, how do you make sure that the kids that attend those camps are protected? And so part of it deals with the reporting structure. So one of the things that happened at Penn State that a lot of colleges have learned from is that a lot of the Penn State employees were essentially Penn State lifers. They'd gone to school there. And so some of the people in that chain of reporting were more concerned with protecting the institution than protecting the victims of those crimes. And so one of the things there is making sure you have some fail-safes in the reporting structure so that things get beyond, part of the coaching staff or part of the athletic administration actually to the police and local authorities who have the ability to investigate those things. And then vehicle accidents, something to consider there. So how do you ensure that, do you require licenses for your athletic training students to drive the gators, the carts that go on and off the field? Do you have mules or different, off-road vehicles that could be problematic? Also related to off-road or related to vehicle accidents, how do you deal with returning home from a game late at night? So one of the things I was thinking about that always seemed particularly risky to me was working as a grad student athletic trainer. We would drive to games, 6-8 hours away. You'd be up all day preparing for the game, getting the field ready, playing the game, helping players after the game, and then after that you got to pack up the truck and then drive 8 hours. And so basically you've been at it since 8 o'clock in the morning, and then you leave the stadium at 11 o'clock at night, and now you got to do an 8-hour drive. And so obviously there's a pretty significant risk that somebody driving one of the U-Hauls that has the sports medicine equipment or some of the football equipment in it or whatever sport you're driving for may fall asleep. And so how do you address that risk as an athletic director? All right. So in terms of perspectives on approaching risk management, so one of the things to think about when you're doing your risk management project, one of the things I want to be sure that you address is this view of a manager of cost. Because in an ideal world, we would have all of the best facilities with brand new weights that aren't rusted and flaking, and we'd have the highest rated, the 5-star helmets that ensure the greatest amount of protection for our football players or hockey players or whatever. But the reality is that's not where we live. And so when addressing a risk, the biggest thing that a manager is going to need to balance is how much risk is there really? What is the likelihood that there's going to be an adverse outcome that's going to cost the school money? Meaning, are they going to lose a lawsuit, or cost their insurance company money and then cause their premiums to rise? So what's the likelihood that that's going to happen? how much money is it probably going to cost them, and then you have to balance that with how much is it going to cost to fix the problem. So if you're an athletic director and you're considering 5-star helmets for your football team versus 3-star helmets for the football team, really one of the things that you're going to consider, like, yeah, you want the best equipment for all of your athletes, but at the same time, if a set of new helmets is going to cost, I don't know, $50,000 versus you can stick with your 3-star helmets and recondition them for $2,000, and the odds are pretty low you're going to end up getting sued over those $3,000 helmets, well, then that's a risk you're willing to take. So one of the things I want you to consider in your risk management projects is when you're looking at facilities and looking at, if you've got some broken tiles, or if the wall is too close to the end lines on the basketball court, or any number of other things, get an idea of how much it's going to cost to fix, because that is one of the key drivers of your decision about whether or not you choose to fix that. So one of the people, when you work professionally, that can help you to decide which things are worth fixing or not are your risk managers. And so risk managers, what they really are good at is kind of the nuts and bolts, the everyday of managing certain types of risk. So for example, if you decide you want to serve alcohol at your football games, well, then you go to the risk managers and say, okay, what needs to happen to make sure that we are exposed as little as possible? So the risk manager might say, okay, well, you're going to need to make sure that all of your people who are servers go through this type of training. It's usually like online module kind of training. Make sure they've completed that, because then if they don't card somebody, that passes the liability on to them, right? And so the risk managers are really good at things like that. They'll also tell you about things like safety inspections, fire prevention, bloodborne pathogens. They can help you out with your emergency action plans, those kinds of things. Other things, or other ways to approach risk management, think of it like an outside auditor. And actually, before I leave the risk manager, one of the things, if not to sully the reputation of any risk managers, but oftentimes if you ask them a question about, hey, can I do whatever, their default answer is no. A friend of mine from a previous institution had worked for several years for a Catholic university in Minnesota, and so she joked that they called their risk manager the Pope of Nope, because whatever it is you want to do, the answer was no. And so at times you do get risk managers like that, but oftentimes they're a little more nuanced in their view of things, and they realize that there are certain things that are risky that we still have to do, whether it is serving alcohol to increase profitability, or allowing youth sport camps to take place on campus, any number of things that come with really significant risk but are better for the university in the long term, or whatever your institution is. So with an outside auditor, what they're going to do is to see the facility with fresh eyes. So there may be things that, because you're in the building every day, that you don't see as risks anymore. But if you have somebody come in from outside, that they may say, oh, well, the wiring for your hot tub is not correct, or water tends to collect in this spot. That can lead to slips. That can lead to mold and mildew, those kind of things. So outside auditors are good for that. Depending on what kind of facility you work in, you may actually have to hire outside auditors. So, for example, hospital facilities are accredited by a body called JCAHO, and so JCAHO does inspections of hospital facilities or healthcare facilities. And so one of the things that facilities will do to make sure they pass all of their surprise JCAHO inspections is they'll hire outside auditors to come in and basically do practice runs and make sure that they so in the case of like food service, that they have food high enough off the floor in the kitchen, that they don't have boxes too close to the ceiling in the kitchen. And there's a number of other like really small things that as a manager you may not even know to look for that auditors will. And so that's one of the other useful things about outside auditors. In terms of the insurance companies, so they're going to have pretty similar interests to the manager, except that their primary concern is how much money do they stand to lose if somebody gets hurt, and how much money do they stand to lose if the case goes to court. So if they get sued, how liable are they for paying for the insurance, but also then how much might they end up having to pay out if you lose. And then one of the things that lawyers are concerned about is the concept of industry standards. So industry standards are not necessarily best practices; they're more like accepted practices. So, for example, a group like the National Strength and Conditioning Association, one of the things that they have as part of their recommendations are cleaning guidelines. And so if somebody comes into your facility and gets a staph infection, and it turns out that you weren't cleaning at all, one of the things that one of the expert witnesses will point to during the trial is the fact that you were out of compliance with industry standards. The NSCA says you should clean your facility every day using these types of products, and you didn't do that. And so because you didn't do that, that led directly to this person's staph infection. So lawyers are going to be pretty concerned with industry standards, and are you doing... are you in compliance with what everybody else is doing, or at least with, not necessarily with what everybody else is doing, but are you in compliance with the recommendations? And then the last one there, jury of your peers. So was your action or inaction reasonable? Did you do what a reasonable person would have done? All right. So in terms of the risk management process, the first thing, and this is what you're going to do with the risk management project. So you're going to go to a facility, or if you can't visit a facility, you're going to go online, or you're going to work from your memory. If you end up having to, use your old high school or something like that, you can do that as well. But the first thing to do is to recognize the risk. So in terms of risk recognition, different categories of risk. So health, one of the ways to think about that is in terms of exposure to pathogens. So usually, prior to this year, when I talked about health, I talked about if you were, overseeing football games or any other sporting events. Let's say overseeing any live sporting events. Most of the time, there are concessions there, and it's possible when you have concessions that there may be, you might have an unclean ice maker, you might not have cooked your foods correctly, you might have left them out of the temperature zone too long, so you might get some sort of foodborne illness, right? And so that then would be a source of risk. But in addition to that, this year, the special risk comes in the form of transmissible diseases. So if you're thinking about somebody like the University of Wisconsin and Camp Randall, one of the really interesting things from a risk management standpoint that athletic officials are having to do this year is, so in college sports, particularly at the Division I level, so much of the financial backbone for the entire athletic department comes from football. Now, to an extent as well, it depends on which school you're at, but football brings in the lion's share of money, and then men's basketball brings in a lot. Some schools, men's baseball brings in some, and then other schools, women's basketball, sometimes women's hockey will bring in some money as well. But the breadwinner, if you will, tends to be football. And so if schools can't have football in the fall, or if they can't have it with fans, that's going to cost a lot of money and may make some athletic departments insolvent. And so many athletic directors are trying to figure out how they can not only have a football game, but how they can get some fans in the stands. So I'm recording this in mid-June of the summer of 2020. And so one of the things I've seen in the headlines in the last several weeks was different schools talking about having 50% capacity or 25% capacity. So Texas Christian University in Fort Worth was talking about, I think, either 25 or 50%. And I'd seen some talk about the University of Texas having 25 or 50% capacity in their stadium, and how you work out that distancing. And so a question to be resolved is, or if you're an athletic director, you're really working with uncertainty here, is how much risk do you bear if somebody goes to one of those football games and gets sick? And I don't think there's a good answer to that question yet. So that's a tough type of risk management to do. Is it becomes difficult to evaluate really what's the risk, because you don't know how likely it is that somebody will be able to trace it back to that one particular game, and if they do, how much liability you bear for somebody contracting a virus or the virus at that game. That aside, so safety from this standpoint, I mean in terms of physical safety. How do you prevent, we talked about player or fan violence. One of the things, if you're, playing a game at Camp Randall and you're playing against a hated rival, you're playing against Minnesota, how do you control the potential for physical violence in the stands or physical violence around the stadium? One of the things that the University of Texas has done for years to tamp down violence in the stands is to break up the opposing fan section and kind of put them around the stadium. But the other thing is they usually put the biggest contingent of visiting fans right next to the former athletes. And so that has seemed to control some of the animosity between the two sides. In terms of crowd control, so how do you get people into the stadium? How do you get them out? How do you prevent people rushing the field? Those kinds of things. And as mentioned on the last slide, so cost is an important concern. So like I said, in an ideal world, you would fix everything and you'd have all the best equipment and all of that. But again, from a management standpoint, you're not able to do that. And so you really have to balance cost versus likelihood of loss. One of the things to consider about that is our perception of risk. So when I was, a couple different things here. So my first job out of college was as a high school teacher and coach. And so as a coach, I coached football, receivers and defensive backs, but I also coached girls basketball. I was the assistant JV coach. And then I was a volunteer powerlifting coach. And then I was also the head tennis coach. And so when I was coaching football, our athletic director at the time didn't want to miss practice for any reason, which is, pretty common. And so I remembered we'd be out there on the field practicing football, and there would be just these massive storms blowing in. And so me and the other assistant coaches would go up to the head coach and athletic director, one and the same person, and say, hey, that lightning looks like it's getting pretty close. Should we leave the field? And so he would literally turn his back on the storm and be like, I don't see any lightning. I think we're good. And we'd just keep practicing. That's as opposed to, so it basically didn't matter how close the lightning got. I don't think we ever canceled a practice for lightning or rain. That's as opposed to after college. So after I'd gone and become an athletic trainer, I was doing contract work as an athletic trainer, also in Central Texas. And I was covering middle school football games. And so I remember one game we were covering, there was a storm blowing in, there was some lightning. It was pretty far off, but there was a little bit of lightning out there. And so we got together with the referees and the head coaches of each team, and we were talking about, hey, what do we do? Do we call this game? Do we delay it? What are we going to do? And so the head coach for the home team had been at a school called Grapeland, which is in East Texas in the mid-2000s. And at Grapeland, their field had been struck by lightning during a practice, and one of the senior football players had died. And so since this coach was there that day, as soon as he saw lightning, he was like, hey, let's call this game. Because his perception of risk was different. Because he'd seen a lightning strike, because a player had died, and he was part of that group, this coach was part of that team, his perception of risk was very different than the football coach and athletic director that I'd worked for previously that would literally turn his back on the storm and be like, we're fine. So risk perception is something to be aware of. Are you maybe extra sensitive to a particular risk because of what you've seen in the past, or are you not sensitive enough to a risk because you haven't seen how bad the outcomes could be? All right, so one of the things to note, recognition and analysis from this standpoint are pretty similar. So in terms of risk identification, so there's common sense. So obviously a track like this where it hasn't been repaired very well and they've got a bunch of markings and maybe some glue, not really sure what the white stuff is. Might just be markings to make people aware that the track isn't even there. But obviously that's the kind of track where, there might be slips. Part of that resurfacing might give way and somebody could be injured. And so that type of a track would be something that would be a risk of injury. Another thing to consider is what is it that your peers are doing? So this particular basketball court, so you can see the end line here is pretty close to the wall. What is that? Maybe a couple feet. So the industry standard there is 10 feet. And if the walls are less than 10 feet, that there's extra padding. And so obviously they have a little bit of padding here. And this is an elementary school. You can see the kids are fairly small. But if somebody's coming in running really fast on a layup, there's a pretty good chance they're going to slam into this wall and they could be injured. So there was a legal case related to that from a Boston area YMCA in the late 1990s. And so what happened was just that. A guy running really hard during a pickup basketball game comes in, throws up a layup, and then is not really able to catch himself before he goes slamming into the wall. So the wall at this particular YMCA was 7 feet behind the basketball court, and did not include any additional padding. So it's an unpadded wall. So he's crashing into this wall. He sticks his arm out to try to catch himself, but in the process of doing that, he dislocates his elbow. So he then sues the YMCA, and one of the things that happens during the trial is that obviously you're going to seek expert opinions, and so you're going to look, or the experts are going to look not only at industry standards, but also what are your peers doing. And so this one particular YMCA gym had baselines really close, walls really close to the baseline, and again, unpadded, and the rest of the YMCAs in the Boston area either had a full 10 feet, or if they were a little bit shorter, they had a lot of extra padding there so that it was less likely you would, dislocate your elbow. And so that fact became really important in the jury's finding for the plaintiff in that case, for the injured basketball player, because what that YMCA was doing was inconsistent with the other Ys in the area. They clearly hadn't taken the same safety precautions that their peer gyms had, and so because of that, this particular gym was found to be liable. Industry standards, again, not best practices, but common practices. As mentioned earlier, those could be industry standards related to cleaning, but when you're doing your risk management project, things to think about, maybe you go to a fitness center and their equipment is really close together. Is there any sort of industry standard from maybe the National Strength and Conditioning Association or the International Health and Racket Sports Association? And there are numerous others, but those are two of the big ones. Do they have any recommendations on how far apart your platform should be spaced, how far apart your treadmill should be spaced, how far the treadmill should be from the wall, those kinds of things? And so are you in compliance with industry standards? Because again, that's going to be something that is going to be very important in determining liability. And just from a more global standpoint, is what you're doing an unreasonable risk? So again, think about what a reasonable person would do, this hypothetical person, and is what you're doing something that is unreasonable? All right, so the next thing then, once we've identified our risks, is to do an evaluation of those risks. So the first question that comes up then is the seriousness of the injury. So if somebody's going to get hurt, how bad? Are we talking about a scratch, or are we talking about a skull fracture? And then tied in with that is, how likely is that injury? So one of the things I want you to consider when you do your risk management project is to use something like this, if I can get it to come up. There we go. This risk matrix. So what you've got here is the types of injuries, right? So something, or severity of injuries, something that is pretty negligible. So these are your scratches down here on the bottom. And then, let's make sure I have my pointer on. So these are your scratches down here on the bottom. This is death up at the top. And so we balance then the likelihood, the severity of the injury with the likelihood that it happened. So if it's something that's highly unlikely and it's going to be a pretty low severity of an injury, well, then we don't really care. That's going to be a risk that we're going to choose to retain because it's not likely it's going to happen. And if they do suffer whatever that injury is, it's not very bad. It's not a big deal. And so there's no reason to alter the activity that we're engaged in with a low likelihood, low severity. On the other hand, if we have high likelihood, high severity, so it's very likely that someone will die as a result of doing this, then maybe that's an activity that we want to discontinue or significantly modify. So your risk evaluation for everything, so for the risk management project, you have to identify 2 risks. And so with both of those risks, I really want you to make sure that you talk about the intersection of the seriousness of the injury with the likelihood of the injury. And then related to the likelihood is the foreseeability. So if it's likely, then it should be foreseeable. So for example, how foreseeable is it that somebody could have a cardiovascular event at a soccer practice? Pretty foreseeable. It may not be very likely, but certainly it is foreseeable that something like that could happen. Same kind of thing, how likely is it that a traumatic brain injury could happen at a soccer practice? It's not very likely, it doesn't happen very often, but it is foreseeable that that could happen given the nature of the game. So it would also be helpful if you identified the foreseeability of those injuries. So the reason my cheerleaders are on here, a previous institution I worked for, a small Division III college that had about 2,500 students, One of the things they had while I was there was a cheerleading squad. And so the cheerleading squad was not varsity, so it was all volunteers. They didn't recruit or anything like that. And so basically, if you were enrolled in the university and you were interested in becoming a cheerleader, for the most part, you could become a cheerleader. So you didn't have to have previous experience or anything like that. They really just wanted to have supporters at the games, and so they would essentially take anybody. And so one of the things that happened is they had this interesting mix of cheerleaders who had been fairly serious during their high school career, who had done a lot of stunting and gymnastics and those kind of things, and then they had other people who were just there because they wanted to be supportive, they wanted to be at the games and all of that kind of stuff. And so where the problem came in was that you had some cheerleaders who, again, didn't really have much in the way of training or experience, and wanted to do some pretty advanced things like are pictured here. And so we also had a volunteer coach who helped with the routines, but wasn't really at practices. So she wasn't really able to supervise a lot of the time because she had a full-time job. So there's a lack of supervision, lack of experience among the participants, and then we only had mats that we used for a karate class to be their safety mats. And so we didn't really have adequate protection over the gym flooring either during their practices. And so you can see there, so I guess in terms of the risk matrix, the severity of injury potentially is fairly high. So I think cheerleading is second only to football in terms of the incidence of major head and neck injuries. And so the severity of injury, then if somebody does one of those stunts where they're flying in the air like that and they fall and they hit the ground, they land on their head, something like that, there's the possibility of a really severe injury. There's a possibility of a skull fracture, neck fracture, etc. And how likely is it? Well, with proper instruction and training and lots of experience, it's less likely, but given the mix of cheerleaders that we had with some pretty inexperienced ones, it became, let's go with likely over here. And so because there's a possibility of a fatality or major injury that is fairly likely, then maybe that's something that we want to avoid. So what ended up happening there was that one of the cheerleaders came and told me as an instructor what was going on, and so then I had to tell the athletic director, because from a risk management standpoint, one of the things to know is if you're an employee of the institution and you're aware of it, then the institution is aware. And so by me being aware that that was happening, now the university itself could be sued. And so one of the things to minimize my own risk that I did was I made sure that the athletic director was aware. So I had reported it to the person who was responsible for that, the person who could change that situation. And so hopefully then by my reporting it, if there had been an injury, I would not be in the chain of individuals being sued for that. It would, my hope was, just have been the athletic director and the university and potentially the cheerleading sponsor. Fortunately, though, there is a happy ending. So the happy ending is that there never was any serious injury, so that was good. But again, you want to trust it to luck entirely, and so that was kind of what we ended up doing. So that's how the risk matrix works as far as risk evaluation goes. Then, so the next step, once you've evaluated the risk, once you've said, okay, it's not very likely, but it's possible that a severe injury could happen, well, now what? Now we got to make a decision, and so that's the action. And so the first thing on there is retention, and if you retain a risk, you basically don't do anything. So you just keep it as it is. So sticking with the cheerleading example, just keep on doing it. Treatment is you're going to try to fix it. You're going to try to minimize that risk somehow. So to stick with the cheerleading example, maybe we start holding tryouts, or we only allow people with a certain amount of experience, or we hire a full-time instructor, or we get better protective equipment. They get thicker mats or something like that. So any of those things would fall under the category of treatment. But of course, all of those things have costs, even if they are not necessarily tangible costs. So if you have tryouts, it's not really going to cost you any money, but that is going to cut down on some of your participation, right? And so then that may affect enthusiasm among the student body, those kinds of things. So there are costs, even if there's not a direct monetary cost associated with things. So that's treatment. And then the other one there, or third one there, is transfer, and that is to pass the risk onto someone else. So that's one of the things that waivers do. So waivers pass the risk onto the participants. That's one of their jobs. But we also can transfer risk by doing things like hiring contract companies or renting equipment. So, for example, a lot of fitness centers rent their equipment from outside companies that are responsible for the maintenance of that equipment. And so, one of the reasons that they do that is to transfer the risk. So, if something happens and the machine breaks, you're on a weight stack machine of some sort, and the cable snaps and it smashes your finger or something. One of the reasons that big gyms rent is to try to then say, well, we hired this contract company to come in and provide us with this equipment, but also to service this equipment, and clearly they failed to do that, and so your injury is the result of their negligence, not the gym's. So they're trying to transfer the risk. And you see the same thing in like food service. So if you have concessions, oftentimes schools will hire contract companies like Aramark, Sodexo, there's a bunch of others, that'll come in and do your concessions for events. And so the idea there is that, as a school district, as a university, you're not experts in food service, and so you're going to hire a company that is, but also you're going to try to pass off some of the risk onto them if somebody gets burned because your coffee's too hot, or they get food poisoning because the food wasn't cooked correctly or stored correctly, that kind of a thing. So that's transfer, passing the risk onto somebody else. And then risk avoidance is you just stop doing whatever that activity is. So if you decide that by having a pool in your gym that the risk is too high, it's too likely somebody will suffer a severe injury, so you're going to eliminate that risk altogether, so you're just going to stop having the pool. You're going to close the pool. That would be risk avoidance. So that one's unusual. You saw that for a little while with football, and some schools are still cutting it, but part of the reason that some schools are eliminating football is related to risk avoidance. The possibility they may get sued down the road for traumatic brain injuries that resulted from people's participation in it for that school. All right, so from a sport management standpoint, some of the sources of risk that you'll fairly commonly encounter, one of them is related to their equipment. So if you are providing athletes with equipment, these are the things you got to think about. So the first one there is proper fitting, and you can see my t-ball player there on the right side does not have a properly fitting helmet. And so obviously that's not going to do anything. So if he were to get injured and it were related to the helmet, then you didn't fit it properly, and so there could be some liability there for you, especially if you were responsible for fitting that. Now with equipment fitting, one of the things that you might wonder is, how would I find guidelines to fit a football helmet versus a lacrosse helmet versus hockey or anything else, right? Because if you're not experienced with the sport, you might not know how to fit the equipment. And so one of the things that I would point out, and this then pertains to industry standards as well, is that typically the NCAA publishes a guidebook that includes fitting of equipment, as does the manufacturer of each of those things. So if you buy a lacrosse helmet, there should be guidelines from the manufacturer about how to fit it correctly. But then also maybe some of the national organizations will do that as well. So whether that's USA Football, hockey, lacrosse, etc., oftentimes they'll have equipment fitting guidelines as well. And the National Athletic Trainers Association typically publishes some level of guidelines on equipment fitting. So there should be lots and lots of sources for you. And so why that's going to matter is if you, let's say, have a football player and you didn't fit their helmet properly and they were injured as a result of that, well, then that's something that you could be liable for, because, again, you weren't acting in accordance with industry standards. You kind of eyeballed their helmet, let's say, as opposed to actually measuring it and fitting it properly. So you would want to be aware then of how to properly fit it and ensure that you act in accordance with those guidelines. In addition to properly fitting the equipment, you got to make sure that you maintain the equipment as well. So, for example, with different helmets, like football helmets, you have to recondition them every so many years. I don't remember the number. I think it's 3. But you have to recondition them every so many years. In the athletic training room, you have to get your equipment recalibrated. So something like your ultrasound machine has to be recalibrated every few years in order to make sure you don't burn people. So you got to follow maintenance, and then as part of that, from a legal standpoint, you're going to want to make sure that you document that you're following that maintenance. So, and if you can document, hey, we had the ultrasound machine inspected every 2 years like the manufacturer says we should, or whatever that number is, then if there's a legal issue that arises related to that machine, at least you'll be able to verify that you were following the manufacturer guidelines. That makes your position from a legal standpoint a lot stronger. And then inspecting equipment. So for example, on the last slide, I showed you the weight machine that had the frayed cable. One of the things you'll want to do if you are, let's say, running a fitness facility is to make sure that there are some guidelines in place for how you're going to inspect the equipment. So maybe like once a month or once every couple weeks, something like that. As part of the duties of the people working the floor, they'll have to go through and check all the cables, make sure that the machines are all, the weight machines are sliding smoothly, those kind of things. So you'd want to build inspection of the equipment into your regular job duties. And again, you're going to want to document that. As far as the facility itself goes, same kind of things. So you're going to want to make sure that you're regularly inspecting the facility, that, again, you're checking for things like standing water, broken seals on things like your hot tubs or your cold tubs, that there aren't, let's go with too little padding underneath your turf, because the turf has to be reconditioned every so many years. And if it's not, then that could present an increased risk of head injuries for people that get tackled on it, those kinds of things. And same kind of thing with maintenance. So making sure that you clean in accordance with industry standards. There's a case related to that from 2008 that the Cleveland Browns lost. They had a receiver, or had signed a receiver, I think prior to 2007 season, maybe a little bit earlier, whose name was Joe Juravicius. He was a pretty good receiver. And so prior to the 2008 season, he had a knee injury and had surgery. And so the Browns said, hey, you should come rehab at our facility, which he wasn't obligated to do. He could have rehabbed anywhere, but the Browns basically said, well, it sort of promotes better team cohesion if you come rehab at our facility. You'll be with your teammates and working with our athletic training staff and all of that. And so we'd really like it if you'd come do your rehab here. And so because of that, Juravicius did, and he ended up getting a staph infection in the surgical cut, or the incision. Got a staph infection in the incision from the surgery, and then because of that staph infection, I think there were at least 5, maybe 7 follow-up surgeries. So there were multiple follow-up surgeries to try to clean the staph out. They weren't able to control it without removing a significant amount of tissue, and so because of that, effectively that staph infection ended Juravicius's career. So because he got that staph infection while rehabbing at the Browns facility, he turned around and sued the Browns for failure to properly maintain their facility. And one of the other things that was part of his lawsuit was in the prior 5 years, I think there were at least 5 players and 2 staff members who'd gotten staph infections at that facility. Certainly in the last year before before he got a staph infection, there were 2 players who got that same infection. And so the Browns failed to disclose that. And so ultimately, he ended up settling with the Browns in 2010. I thought I had the monetary award on there, but I don't. So ultimately, he ended up settling with the Browns over that. So if you're not maintaining your facility like you should, and that leads to an injury, whether it's due to a pathogen like staph or whether that's due to broken railing or something like that, either way, you can be liable for those things. All right. So other sources of risk. From a coaching standpoint, if you or the coaches that you supervise fail to properly instruct and train your athletes, that can be a source of liability. So one of the things that my picture on there, you notice the Giants defensive player there not the Giants, sorry, the 49ers. It's confusing baseball and football there. The 49ers defensive player there on the left side making head-down contact. You can see he's leading with the crown of his helmet there. And so obviously that's a dangerous position to be in. That can result in a neck fracture or a dislocation. So we want people to not tackle like that. But one of the jobs of coaches is to not only try to keep athletes from doing that, to properly instruct and train them, but also to warn them about the dangers of tackling in that fashion. So there's a case from 1985 from the Seattle area where the Seattle Public School District was sued successfully when a running back for their football team was basically using his head, so rather than the defensive player, as an offensive player, and he kept putting his head down when the defensive players would come at him to try to ward them off. and ultimately suffered a neck injury when somebody else made helmet-to-helmet contact with him. And so he was able to successfully sue the school by arguing that the coaches failed to properly warn him that that was a dangerous way to play. So you have to not only properly instruct the athletes, here's how it should be done, but also then include in that a warning of, and if you don't, here are the negative outcomes that can occur. Obviously, you're not going to use that particular language with kids, but that's the idea there. Here's how we're going to tackle, and here's why. And so where that comes up recently is, for example, if you followed football at all, and you can see where my interests typically lie, the way that tackling is done now is much different than it was taught 20 years ago. If you know, oftentimes coaches do what was done to them. We teach the same way that we were taught. And if you were to go out, or if I were to go out and teach athletes to tackle the same way that I was taught, that's not what is taught anymore. And so if athletes were tackling in that same way and suffered a concussion, then I could be liable for that injury. Now, they're probably not going to sue over a concussion, but you know, repeated head injuries or something like that, I would be liable for failure to properly instruct and train. Another thing in there, make sure everybody has the proper safety equipment. So make sure, you know, their helmet's in good working order, pads, etc. Make sure that they have the appropriate padding. So you don't, you know, send all your football players out there without leg pads, for example, those kinds of things. There was a case in the mid-1990s from Illinois, I think from the Chicagoland area, where there was a basketball player who got elbowed in the face, and as a result of getting elbowed in the face, he fractured his cheekbone. So, you know, you got to protect that fracture, and so he goes to the doctor. Doctor gives him one of those clear plastic face masks that you've probably seen if you watch pro or college games. And so he has that clear plastic face mask on, and he goes back to practice, and he's wearing that again to protect the fracture, and the coach looks at it and says, well, you know, that might actually injure the other players. If they were to elbow you in the face again, they might cut their elbow or something, and so you should not wear that. And so the coach instructed the player not to wear the safety equipment that was prescribed by the doctor. Player got elbowed in the face again and actually ended up losing vision in that eye. And so the reason he lost vision was as a result of the instruction from the coach, right, to not wear the safety equipment that was prescribed from the physician. And so obviously the coach was found liable in that case. So one thing I would urge you to do is don't contradict doctor instructions. If they were told, you know, not to participate by their physician, or they were told to avoid certain things, go with that. Don't act on your own judgment against the instructions of the physician, because then you are entirely exposed if something goes wrong. Other things on there, and this one's particularly with kids, competitive mismatches. So if you're coaching youth sports, one of the things you have to be aware of, and it's pretty obvious, but just something to be cognizant of, is when you've got a kid who is really developed and a kid who is really not making them go against each other one-on-one repeatedly. So for example, having coached youth football last season, I coached 3rd and 4th graders in flag football, and we had one kid on the team who was easily a head taller than the second tallest kid, and then we had another kid on the team who probably came up to that guy's sternum maybe. And so if I put those two against each other in one-on-one flag drills, I mean, the smaller kid would just get freight trained over and over and over again. And so eventually, you know, there's a pretty high likelihood that he could get hurt as a result of that. And that's not something that would happen in a game. You would move your players around or something to avoid that competitive mismatch. So there's no reason to practice doing that. So as much as possible, you try to avoid those really substantial competitive mismatches. And even from a more holistic standpoint, for the kid that's getting just shown up or run over or whatever repeatedly, they're probably not going to persist in that sport. And so you want to give them an opportunity to be successful as well. Plus, your really good, really developed kid isn't really improving their skills when they're just, running roughshod over a smaller, less developed kid. So avoid competitive mismatches where you can. And then account for lack of experience. So that kind of falls under competitive mismatches. Sometimes you've got a kid who's less physically developed, and sometimes you just have a kid who's less experienced. They don't know how to play as well, and so it's easy for them to get shown up and possibly get hurt. So if you're an athletic director, what do you want to do? You know, from a risk management standpoint, how do you address that? Keys there are to at least be conversant in the sport, to know the proper progression of lead-up games. You need, a certain type of foundational skill in I don't know, dribbling or tackling or whatever, and then how you progress and how you build upon those skills. And so, being aware of what your coaches are doing and making sure that they're building upon those foundational skills and not just jumping into, full team scrimmages or something. Other things on there, in terms of, that's where I was going to go with. Sorry, I was thinking of something else. So on lack of experience, one of the things to be aware of is that as a coach, oftentimes you might end up coaching a sport that you don't know much about. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that I was a high school coach in Texas right out of my undergrad, and so I coached girls basketball in addition to football. So football I played and I knew enough about. I enjoyed football, so I was good on that. But coaching girls basketball, I didn't know anything about basketball really, or next to nothing about basketball. Certainly didn't know how to coach it. And then, as mentioned, I was the head tennis coach. And so when I was given that assignment by the athletic director and told me I was going to be the head tennis coach, I was like, I don't even know the rules. Like, I couldn't even begin other than the ball has to go over the net. Like, I don't know anything about tennis. And so we're having this conversation in his office, and he's sitting there in his office chair, and he's got his head on his hand, and he thinks about it for a second. And he stops and he points at me and he says, "All right, we'll get you a video." And so, got to keep in mind, this is 2004. So this is before you could just YouTube anything. And so he bought me a VHS tape, if you've ever seen those. So I got a VHS tape on how to coach tennis, and then like 3 or 4 books. And so that was what I got on coaching tennis. So my lack of experience in coaching tennis probably wasn't going to get anybody hurt. But one of the other sports that I volunteered with, because I had done it in college, was powerlifting. And so being around powerlifting as a competitor, as a coach, and then eventually as an official in powerlifting, one of the things I saw all the time at the high school level was you'd have these high school coaches who got told that they were going to be a powerlifting coach, just like I got told I was going to be the tennis coach. Guys that had no idea what they were doing, and they were like, all right, this kid can't even squat. Let's see how much weight we can put on there and see how much they can lift. And so watching that, coaches who didn't know how to teach proper form in deadlift or proper form in squats and put kids in really bad positions where their form was horrific and they were likely to hurt themselves, that was pretty tough. So as a supervisor, it behooves you to try to be aware of your staff's maybe lack of experience. So if you're putting somebody, in charge of powerlifting or especially Olympic weightlifting where they're going overhead, who doesn't know anything about it, making sure that you get them the best resources or access to the best resources possible so that they can educate themselves and they can teach the sport effectively. Maybe you offer some kind of a clinic. Maybe there's a continuing ed opportunity. Maybe there's one at a nearby university or something like that. A way to get them some good experience before you just kind of throw them into the fire, and then throw your athletes into the fire too, because their coach may not really know what's going on. So just something to think about, both from the standpoint as someone who might coach, whether it's coaching at a YMCA or interscholastic sport, but also somebody who might supervise those things. Speaking of supervision, so another source of liability for schools in particular, but also for things like day camps, rec centers, YMCAs, etc., is supervision. So sticking with the school example, making sure you're supervising the locker rooms, because there can be hazing, there can be fights. Those are probably the 2 big incidents types of incidents you'd have to keep an eye out for. So you want to make sure that you have coaches kind of circulating through the locker room. Nobody's just going to hang out in there because that's kind of weird. But, you circulate through, right? You're working on the laundry or whatever, and so you're kind of in and out. But at the very least, you're aware if something happens. And then one of the other things that gets tough, especially as a coach, is that you are responsible for those athletes from the time that they're dropped off until the time that they're picked back up. So, and where that becomes challenging is, if it's a Tuesday night and you got home from a soccer game or a basketball game at 10 o'clock and their parents aren't there yet, you're waiting and you got to wait till 11 o'clock or something like that. I mean, that's challenging. And so you can't just leave them there, so you have to wait until everybody gets picked up. But another thing is that, like after practice, you got to be careful just turning the athletes loose. There's a case from the Miami area several years ago where after football practice, the coaches are basically just like, "See ya." And so one kid went to the school's cafeteria to wait for his parents to pick him up. And I think the athletic period was basically the last period of the school day, and so there were kids just kind of hanging out in the cafeteria in addition to these football players. And so one of the football players who was hanging out waiting for his parents to pick him up after practice got beaten up by some of the other kids hanging out. And so the family sued the school for failure to supervise. And the school said, well, maybe, but the intervening negligence of these kids, that's obviously an intentional tort on the part of these other students who battered this athlete. Their intervening negligence makes them liable instead of us. And the court agreed that there was obviously intervening negligence on the part of the other students who battered the player, but they went on to say that that didn't absolve the school of their responsibility to supervise those students until supervision of them was transferred to their parents. So basically from just turning them loose after practice, the school was still liable because they failed to supervise the area where students were known to congregate in and around the cafeteria. All right. Another area where schools are often found liable is the failure to provide prompt and adequate medical assistance. So this comes up where, oftentimes due to budget constraints, because we talked about managers having to, weigh the costs, oftentimes schools won't have athletic trainers or medically trained personnel at every practice. So maybe you don't have them at voluntary practices. Maybe you don't have them at your spring practices. So you remember the case that you read related to Gettysburg College lacrosse, where they didn't have athletic trainers at the lacrosse practice because it was, I think they were doing, because it's a spring sport and it was a fall practice or something to that effect. And so because it was an off-season practice, they didn't have medical personnel there, and an individual had an arrhythmia that resulted in ventricular fibrillation. So because of that, because you're not going to have medical personnel there all the time, one of the things that you might have to do is to ensure that your coaches are trained in first aid and CPR, and ensure that you have any medical equipment there that they might need. So whether that's an AED, a defibrillator, in case somebody has a cardiovascular event, or whether that's splints or a trainer bag in case there's bleeding, those kinds of things. You make sure they have the equipment that they need and the base training that they would need to address any emergency situations. Essentially, you want to make sure they don't make it worse and that they're able to contact help and get it there as soon as possible. So some of those issues that have historically arisen in cases have gotten better because of cell phones and better receptions and more towers and those kinds of things. There are cases like, for example, the Gettysburg College case, because it's from the 80s, there were no cell phones, and so there was no working phone nearby. One athlete had to scale the fence of the football stadium to get to the training room inside the football stadium. Somebody else had to go run over to the student union. And there was a lot that had to happen there in order for somebody to contact help. So, of course, in these days of cell phones with pretty good reception, that's not usually an issue. Now, sometimes it still is. Maybe you got you're in a building that doesn't get cell phone reception. So maybe you're in a weight room inside of a stadium that has lots of concrete, doesn't get very good reception. So those are things that you would want to account for. But as it pertains to prompt and capable medical assistance, you want to think about what are all of the reasonably foreseeable incidents that could happen, and have we figured out a way to address them? Because that's one of the things that didn't happen in the Gettysburg College case, is that the coaches had never talked about how to deal with a cardiovascular event, and that's something that's reasonably foreseeable that would happen during a strenuous sport that involves a lot of running, like lacrosse. So, and on a similar note, Rashidi Wheeler, who's the gentleman pictured there in the lower right, he was a football player, actually a defensive back, at Northwestern University in the early 2000s. And so one of the things at the time was that there were a lot of restrictions on coach supervision of summer workouts at that time. And so the Northwestern players had gotten together at the practice field for quote-unquote voluntary workouts, meaning that they were all there because they wanted to be, and there was not supposed to be, per the rules, a coach supervising at the time. So Wheeler and a bunch of the other Northwestern football players did a series of sprints. They did 28 sprints between 40 and 100 yards, so a pretty good sprint workout. At the end of the workout, Wheeler collapses. So he did have asthma that was well controlled, and he had his inhaler with him. But the teammates then try to get him help after he collapses. They go and access the phone that's at the practice facility, but it's broken. So again, it's 2001. Because they're out there as football players, nobody has their cell phones with them because they have pretty rudimentary cell phones at the time. I had one, and so it's the old phones. You had to push the same button a bunch of times. And so they didn't have their phones, so the one phone at the field didn't work. So then they had to run somewhere else, kind of like the Gettysburg case, to go contact help. It took the ambulance, I think, 40 minutes to get to the field, and so Rashidi ends up being transferred to the nearby hospital, but ultimately passes away. One of the interesting sort of asides on that case is that, again, it's supposed to be an unsupervised workout, but there was video of the workout, and it looked like one of the school's strength coaches was there supervising. But again, because it was quote-unquote voluntary, there were no medical personnel there. So there was no way to handle any sort of medical emergencies. And so as a result of his death, Rashidi's family sues the school, sues Northwestern. The university alleges that he took 2 supplements that contained ephedra, which is an amphetamine. And so we've talked about some of the issues with amphetamines and exercise performance. It helps, but it presents a danger in terms of potentially arrhythmias, but also with respect to heat illness. So ultimately, the university ends up settling that lawsuit, and I think they settled for, pretty sure I have it, got to change pages, $16 million. So the suit was settled in 2006 for $16 million because, again, in that case, the school failed to provide prompt and adequate medical assistance. The phone didn't work, so they couldn't, if it had worked, maybe the help would have gotten there a little bit sooner. Maybe they could have gotten his core temperature down faster or been able to get an AED to him sooner, whatever he would have needed at the time. So from an athletic director standpoint, make sure that you have medical personnel at as many things as you can afford. So, and you may have to triage that some. So you may only have one athletic trainer. Send them to the high contact sport where the injuries are most likely to occur. But if the athletic trainer, if you can't have sports medicine personnel there, make sure that your coaches are certified in first aid and CPR, that they have the ability to contact medical assistance, so cell phones that work in that area, or a landline if needed. And then also that they know how to use basic medical equipment. So they know how to use the AED, that they would know how to stop bleeding. So again, they know how to do first aid and CPR. So those are some base things that you want to ensure. And if you do that, typically you're pretty well covered from a liability standpoint. Again, you want to think about foreseeable risks and make sure you've planned for them. Speaking of plans, so one of the ways that you plan for those foreseeable risks is called an emergency action plan. And so if you get into athletic administration, but also in sports medicine, you're going to have to develop emergency action plans. So athletic trainers have to develop these all the time. And so I'll run through these fairly quickly, but things that are included in emergency action plans include all the personnel that are going to be there and what it is that they do. And obviously that's going to vary a little bit. So it's going to be pretty professional if you're at a Badgers game. You're going to have paramedics who have spine boarded lots of people who've dealt with serious head and neck injuries fairly routinely. They're going to be really good at dealing with that situation. You don't have to worry about crowd control or anything like that. But if you're at a high school game at a small school, fairly far out, it's going to be a different situation. You may or may not have paramedics on site. If there are emergency personnel there, they might be volunteers. So there's a little bit of a difference in the level of training. And again, if they're not on site, it may take them a while to get out there. There may be some crowd control issues. So I say that based on my grad school experience where we, from the university, would go out, because the university I went to was out in rural East Texas. And so the athletic trainers from the university would go cover some of the high schools in the area. And so one of the high schools that we covered was a fairly small high school. It's a 2A high school that probably had about 300 total kids in the school. And so there was an injury on the field. One of the kids on the home team got injured. And so the staff athletic trainer and I, as the grad assistant, were out there looking at this kid. And his mom came running on the field. And so a panicky mom is never going to make things better. And so one of the things that is often included in emergency action plans is who's in charge of crowd control. So oftentimes you'll put coaches in charge of that because they're going to know the moms a lot better than we did. So as contract sports medicine people, we didn't know the mom at all. But obviously the coaches did. So that's one of the things that you would include in your emergency action plans is who's going to be there and who does what. You may also need somebody to go meet the ambulance. Sometimes athletic facilities, so for example, a university where I worked previously, to get to the baseball field, if something had happened, there used to be kind of like a dirt road you'd have to drive down in order for the ambulance to actually access the field. And so that may not be something that shows up on their GPS. And so you might have to send somebody out to meet the ambulance to direct them. Emergency phone number is not as important these days because obviously you have cell phones. Emergency equipment, though, things that you want to account for. So again, making sure you got the AED, splint bag, athletic trainer bag that has it has all the equipment you need to stop bleeding. But other things you might need, so if you have a diabetic athlete, do you have glucose tabs? If you have athletes that have anaphylactic reactions, do you have the EpiPens? Are they out of date? Because the EpiPens have pretty short shelf lives, so those kinds of things. And then, again, if it's a weird sort of venue or if it's a new venue, so you run into that sometimes as well, it may not be on the GPS yet, so just making sure that you have the directions there if it's something that they might need. One of the biggest things with emergency action plans is to practice it regularly. So oftentimes, and I've done this myself, you'll create an emergency action plan and then put it in a binder and then stick that binder on the shelf and never look at it again. And so obviously that's not something we want to do because if you don't practice it, the plan is no good. Nobody's going to be able to carry it out. So you probably haven't seen this because they usually cut away to commercials, but like NFL athletic trainers and their work with paramedics, watching them, if you've got a football player that has a neck injury or suspected neck injury, seeing how quickly they can put them on the spine board, get them on a stretcher, and get them out of the into the ambulance and out of the stadium, it's really impressive. But the reason it's so impressive, the reason they're so quick and so good is because they practice all the time. And so making sure that people actually go through the plan is really important. Typically, if you're at a college or high school, that happens in the summer, kind of in the lead up to the school year. So other things as far as sports medicine goes, establishing how you're going to remove protective equipment. So things like face masks, how are you going to get those off of helmets? So you're going to use a screwdriver, you're going to cut them off. Good and bad to each. Screwdrivers are the best way, the electric screwdrivers, because they're fast and you don't move the head very much. Downside is you got to make sure the batteries are charged. And so the upside to like pruning shears to cut off face masks is that no batteries. Downside is you typically move the head around a lot, which is usually not what you're trying to do if you're cutting off a face mask. As far as access to phones goes, just one of the things I would urge you to think about is if you're in a location where there's not very good cell phone reception. So for example, this weekend we were out at a park pretty far out, maybe an hour and a half from Madison. And so the cell phone reception was basically zero at that place. So one of the things I would urge you to consider is what you're going to do to contact help if there's no, if the phones aren't working. And again, sometimes in a facility, if it's lots of concrete and that kind of stuff, there just won't be very good reception. It may just be one provider, but something to think about. Keys and padlocks, that goes with getting access to a field. So sometimes the ambulance will need to drive onto the field, so just making sure that whoever has the keys to give access to that is on site when there are events at that field. Carrying insurance for all your players while you're traveling. I mentioned this one, so having the appropriate supplies for athletes who are diabetic or have allergies. My little EpiPens are pictured in the lower right. And then again, make sure you practice your emergency action plan. From a sports medicine standpoint, other things to consider: concussion management plan, making sure that you have a good return to play criteria, and this has obviously gotten a lot better in the last 10 years. You have them work up on the stationary bike and then to running or jogging, jogging and running, and then to cutting, and then so there's a systematic plan in place and certain criteria they have to hit before you let them go back. And oftentimes now people use computer programs, so Impact is a name brand, but there are other programs that you can use as well. So it's usually a combination of performance and computer programs. But the gist of it is making sure that you have solid guidelines in place so you don't get an individual who comes back too early and gets re-injured or worse. Cardiovascular issues, again, make sure you got an AED and you have your coaches and other personnel trained in first aid and CPR. Heat illness, just be aware of it and figure out how you're going to address it. If you got an athlete that gets overheated, how are you going to cool them off? That may include like having a tarp at the field and then just have some extra buckets of ice and water. And then if you have an athlete that goes in a heat stroke, you basically just kind of stick them in the middle of the tarp, have their teammates hold the sides of the tarp up, and basically you have a portable cold tub. You dump all the ice and the water on them, cool them right off. Pre-participation exams are physicals, and so those help transfer the risk off of you as the department offering the sport. So just make sure your athletes have one of those before they play. Crisis management is similar to an emergency action plan, as you can see there, but it's wider in scope. So this is a picture. There wasn't a game going on at the time, but this is the University of Alabama's football stadium with a tornado in the background. And so you can see there the heart attack, something that happens to one individual, that's an emergency action plan, as opposed to a tornado. You get potentially lots and lots of injuries, lots of damage to physical facilities, and so that's a crisis management plan. So how are we going to evacuate the stadium if there was an approaching tornado, and where do we tell people to go? Do we tell them to go to their cars? Are they going to go under the stadium? Where are we going to put people? So making sure you think about things like that, and terrorism obviously also falls under that as well. So if there were a bombing or a shooting or anything like that, how are you going to evacuate the stadium, and where will you tell people to go to seek shelter? Lightning safety I included because of the football coach that I worked for. So remember I said that risk is based on your perception. And so one of the things that I would always make sure I would have in place is a plan of who calls practice, who decides when practice is over, and what are the guidelines. So if there's lightning within 8 miles, 3 miles, what's your cut point for deciding that practice needs to be canceled for the day? And then similarly, when can you resume? So 30 minutes after the last strike, is there a mileage on the lightning, those kinds of things. And then lastly, when you're crafting your emergency action plans, making sure that you account for individuals with disabilities, because as part of your facility, it was probably designed so that you have reasonably accommodated a variety of disabilities so that everybody can enjoy the facility, everybody can watch games and participate in all of that. And so you want to make sure that you also account for individuals with disabilities as far as getting people out of the stadium if you need to for either crisis or emergency management. And that is it for risk management. That was pretty long, but that's it. So make sure you check out the risk management project. Start thinking of a facility. Again, it can't be the Williams Center. I've read that report too many times. So start thinking about facilities. If you have problems finding one or thinking of one, let me know, and we'll see what we can come up with. And then we'll see you again next time for agency law.